But as teachers, we also have influence. It does our students no service to sugarcoat U.S. hypocrisy, no service to paper over criminality. If our students are entering a system that is already primed to push them toward militarism, our most basic responsibility is to give them the intellectual and ethical tools to push back against that. I hope today's discussion is continued in many of our classrooms this week as a new generation of students continues to grapple with the fallout from one of the greatest crimes ever perpetrated by our nation's political class. Now I'll turn it over to Krystal Ball, who is the co-host of the independent political news show Breaking Points, which is frequently ranked the #1 news podcast on Spotify, and I am also a listener. She is co-author with Sagar Enjeti of the best-selling book, The Populist's Guide to 2020.
Thank you. Thank you, Shana. Thank you so much to the school for hosting this discussion. Thank you so much to Quincy Institute for pulling this important conversation together. Because as much as we move forward from the Iraq War 20 years later, the way that moment, catastrophic as it was, completely upended our political system, our country, an entire region, in some ways, the entire world, bears reflecting on deeply. Because many of those lessons, I think, haven't really been learned at this point, and the focus of the media, I think, is absolutely paramount. Before I jump into questions, let's just have a round of applause here. All three of our panelists. Have been, I think, very courageous in their own ways. And Peter, I actually want to start with you, because of our three panelists, you were the one that, at the time, you got it wrong. And it wasn't inconsequential the way that you got it wrong, because you were editor of The New Republic. The New Republic was and is an incredibly influential liberal magazine. So you were a key part of making the case to otherwise potentially reticent liberals that this war was just, that it was ethical, that it was the thing that we should do. Now, I follow your work. You're incredibly intelligent, as best I can tell, very ethical. You've demonstrated lots of courage in terms of your reporting and analysis. So what was it that went wrong for you at that point in time?
Thanks. And I first just want to say, can everyone hear me? That this may be obvious to say, but it's important that Quincy could have chosen a number of many opinion journalists who, unlike me, got it right. Even though there were many liberals like myself who supported the war, there were others who did not. I think The Nation magazine, for instance, The New Republic, kind of a long competitor, I would highly recommend you go back and read The Nation, the editorial that it published on the eve of the war. E.J. Dionne at the Washington Post, for instance, was opposed to the war. So I don't want to make it sound as if everyone who got it wrong like me. There were many, many honorable people who were far wiser than I. So I have spent a lot of time trying to understand the set of assumptions that led me to this kind of catastrophic error in judgment. Because I felt at a certain point that I just, either I was going to refashion my whole approach to American foreign policy, or I just needed to go into a different line of work altogether. Because it wasn't just that I had been wrong about Iraq. Iraq was the product of a whole set of assumptions and ideas I had about America's role in the world. And when I wrote a book trying to wrestle with this called the Icarus Syndrome, the basic argument of the book is that the war was, at least for people like me, the product of a hubris that had been building since the 1980s. And it was a hubris that had built, and it was a hubris that had built from a number of factors. One of which was the series of victories, or at least apparent victories, in a series of small wars that had started in Panama in the late 1980s. It's interesting, Ronald Reagan was considered this hugely great hawkish figure, but Reagan was actually very much restrained by the legacy of Vietnam in terms of his deployment of American troops. He was very reticent, so reticent that he would not even send U.S. troops into Panama. But then George H.W. Bush did, and there were not a lot of loss of U.S. life. And then the Gulf War, people of my generation in particular, you grew up, if you were a liberal, hearing people you looked up to. Remember the New York Times editorial page, Ted Kennedy, saying that these wars would be another Vietnam. First Panama, then the Gulf War, then Bosnia and Kosovo, which were very influential at the New Republic because they were wars against a kind of fascist ethnic cleansing government, and people said it would be another Vietnam, and it wasn't another Vietnam. I don't want to suggest these wars were antiseptic, that innocent people didn't die, that they were uncomplicated, not at all. But they weren't another Vietnam. And this trajectory was a little bit, I think of it like Las Vegas. You go to Las Vegas, you put down a small bet, and you win, and you gradually lose the sense of humility and caution, and you put down bigger and bigger bets. So I think partly it was this belief that the U.S. military, because the perception had been that it had been successful, could do these things, which in retrospect, obviously it could not do. The second was, I think, a very uncomplicated, and one might say, kind of American exceptionalist interpretation of the third wave of democratization. The third wave of democratization, which sweeps through not just Eastern Europe, but parts of Africa, Latin America, Asia, in which democracy starts to seem much more of a kind of universal creed, or at least it comes to seem that a much wider variety of countries can build liberal democracies than appeared earlier in like the 1970s and 1980s, I think created this, in retrospect, kind of deeply naive view that essentially if you kind of ripped off a dictatorship, that a kind of liberal democracy would naturally emerge. And that was also fueled by watching what the Kurds were doing in northern Iraq under some kind of U.S. protection, where they seem to have a somewhat functioning open society, and the influence of Iraqi exiles like Khan Makia, who were saying that this could happen in all of Iraq. And the last point I would make, which I think fueled my hubris, is the fact that the budget deficit had been overcome in the 1990s. If you look at the history of American war making, you tend to find that America is more interventionist when it seems like it has a lot of money around. And oftentimes America's wars end because the money runs out. But the overcoming of the budget deficit in the 1990s, I think, created a government that was kind of flush with cash, and which the trade-offs for war didn't seem as acute at the time as they should have seemed to people like me. So I think those were the kind of cocktail of things that led to the hubris that led me to make this really extraordinary mistake.
Before I get to the other panelists, just one quick follow-up. How much was some of the reporting, in particular from the New York Times, it's a paper of record, very trusted by liberals, how much was that reporting influential in terms of your own thinking?
I mean, there was a combination, right? First of all, you had not just the Bush administration was kind of exaggerating the intelligence, but there wasn't a lot of pushback from Democrats, right? And there had been the former Clinton administration people were generally of the view that Saddam had this nuclear weapons program and that he had kind of WMD. A lot of foreign governments did. So even when one saw that even when there was little pieces of reporting, which is that, this particular claim about, uranium yellow cake, maybe that's a little wobbly. I think I was trapped, like many people, certainly in this overall expectation that, look, he had a nuclear program on the eve of the Gulf War. He had been closer than a lot of people thought. The expectations had kind of run out, so there were no eyes and ears on the ground anymore. Given this was a bipartisan assumption held by a lot of U.S. allies, even some governments that opposed the war still thought he probably had a nuclear program. So it was that set of things that I think led me to be credulous and not to pay more attention to some of the terrific reporting that was done at the time.
Well, I think that's a perfect intro to jump over to Jonathan, who was looking at this, same landscape. And what I keep thinking about with you, Jonathan, is there you are doing this incredible reporting, doing all the work that involves and working your sources and churning out these incredible blockbuster stories. And at the very same time, you would see something, usually Judy Miller in the New York Times, with a scoop, quote unquote, that directly contradicted your reporting. Just on a human level, what was that like? I mean, did you feel like you were going crazy? Did you doubt yourself? Were you enraged? Did you see it through it from the beginning? Just take us back to that time.
So, thanks very much for having me. Apologies that I was late. Journalism. First of all, a couple of administrative things. I work for Reuters now, but back then I was working for Knight Ridder. It doesn't exist anymore. It was bought out by McClatchy. It's a victim of the consolidation of local and national newspapers and metropolitan newspapers that took place during the Great Recession. Secondly, and most importantly, I was part of a team. My team consisted of my former reporting partner, Warren Strobel, who's now with the Wall Street Journal. Later addition to our team was the late Joe Galloway of We Were Soldiers Once and Young, who was just an amazing asset, but we kept his name off a lot of our stories because he insisted on that because he wanted to protect his sources. And then our editor, John Walcott, and just sort of as shameless promotion here, if you haven't seen it, go watch Rob Reiner's movie, Shock and Awe. It's about the work that we did, the four of us. And now to get to your point, and one of the themes of Shock and Awe, and much of this movie is absolutely accurate down to some of the dialogue, the newsroom dialogue. It was extremely lonely. There we were writing these stories, and there's a line in the movie where we've got Dick Cheney on television who was talking about an extremely classified issue, which was aluminum tubes. I don't know if any of you remember the whole aluminum tubes thing, but the administration was contending that that Saddam Hussein had imported these aluminum tubes that were going to be used. He was going to use for centrifuges to enrich uranium for nuclear bomb fuel, and they did that deliberately. So he was able to go on TV because they had leaked the story to Judy Miller of the New York Times, and she had put it on the front page on a Sunday. And there's a line in the movie where I look at Warren, who and the guy who's playing Warren, and I said, "There's one thing happening here. We both can't be right." And yes, it was incredibly lonely. I ended up actually refuting the aluminum tube story, but it took place about a year later. And it prompted the New York Times to print what they call an editor's note, which was basically saying, whoops, we've done a lot of great reporting on Iraq, but we've got some problems, and now we're going to go back and review our reporting. They put it on page 10. And in fact, it was incredibly lonely. And from a personal point of view, a couple of things. They didn't put this in the movie. But I would wake up at night at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning after we'd run one of our big stories and refuting both the administration's case on the intelligence or the alleged link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, and wonder why am I the only one out? Why are we the only ones out there doing this? Similarly, during that period, I was living out in Bethesda, out in Glen Echo, and I would ride my bike to and from work, and at night I would after publishing one of these exclusives, I would start having these weird, very paranoid feelings that Ahmad Chalabi of the Iraqi National Congress and his people might decide to take me out on my way home in the dark, because our reporting was essentially pulling the rug out from under this group that stood to make literally billions of dollars and take power in Iraq. And that was the intent of the Bush administration, was to put Ahmad Chalabi and his people in power, because they had persuaded the administration that he had all these generals and senior officials all lined up, and all they were going to have to do is sweep off the top layer of the Iraqi regime and replace it with him and his people, and all these other people would rise up against Saddam, and it was just pure fantasy. And so, it was very lonely. We didn't have Twitter. We didn't have we barely had the internet. We didn't have any social media. So there was no way for us to be able to promote our stories beyond the 32 newspapers that Knight Ridder owned. And oh, by the way, some of these newspapers refused to run our stories. Why? Because it wasn't in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times or the networks. There was, in fact, one of our main newspapers, and I'm not going to name which one, actually the managing editor assigned 2 reporters to go and fact check our reporting. his own company, reporters who work for their own company for fact check us and see whether or not, we were being led down the path by our sources. And I'll finally, I'll just say that we had a rule when we were, 2 rules actually, when we were reporting this out. And by the way, our stories, I went into the Knight Ridder, the McClatchy archive. I can't get in there because it's behind the paywall. But I was able to get into the compendium of all the stories we wrote between 2001 and 2007. And there are scores of them. And they went basically largely unnoticed, and we can talk about this later, as how we finally got noticed. But the rules were this, that and this is a line in the movie, and it's absolutely accurate, it took place in the newsroom, where John Walcott looked at us and he said, we are Knight Ridder, we don't report for the people who send other people's daughters and sons to war. We report for the families whose sons and daughters get sent to war. And because Knight Ridder's newspapers, we did a calculation, I forget how many we determined, but our papers, the 32 papers, served a large number of US military bases. And that's who we envisioned our audience to be, not the power centers in New York or Washington or LA. And finally, we had a 2-source rule. We weren't going to write something that we couldn't get 2 sources on. And so, 20 years later, it all stands up.
Yeah, well, if you could, with the benefit of hindsight, answer your own question. Why were you the only ones?
I mean, that's a question we keep getting asked and we keep trying to answer, and I think there's a couple of answers. One, it was the sort of consolidation of what I call American nationalism at that time as a result of 9/11, where you had people driving around all over the country with these bumper stickers, support our troops, and you had Bush going to the World Trade Center and making that speech. I mean, the amount of sort of flag waving, knee-jerk nationalism was enormous. And I'm not sure, I can't say this for sure, but I'm not sure that other news organizations wanted to lose revenue, and that was particularly on TV, by doing reporting that went up against the grain, that went up against the administration. There's a scene in the movie. I don't want to spoil the movie for you. It's still you can still find it. But this was part of the loneliness, right? So I think that's one problem. That there was this desire not to go up against this huge current of pro-war, pro-administration sentiment. Secondly, we have in this town something called access journalism, right? Access journalism is about having sources in highly placed positions, usually political appointees, and you don't want to do any reporting that is going to end your access to these sources. And look, don't get me wrong, we had some extremely high-level sources for our reporting, but we also went to mid and lower level people who are actually doing the grunt work. We're actually doing the analysis. We're actually seeing the intelligence. And as Joe Galloway liked to say, he said, you don't go if you want to get a story about, he made his bones in Vietnam. If you want to get the story of how badly the war was going, you don't go to, or where the war is going. You don't go to the generals, right? You don't go to the politicians. You go to the master sergeants and the corporals and the grunts in the trenches to find out how things are going. You don't go to the people who've got the agenda. Mm-hmm. And finally, that agenda, I mean, political appointees are political appointees. They have a political agenda. And when they talk to reporters, for the most part, they are trying to sell that agenda. And we saw what happened, and it's not just the New York Times, although they were the most egregious. But at one point I did a story, which I got an award for, I got a list of 108 stories that the Iraqi National Congress had told our Congress they had salted their garbage into. And it was a cornucopia of top US newspapers and magazines and networks. And one McClatchy newspaper there were 2 stories from one Knight Ridder newspaper that was in that list.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, I guess that's the best way I can put it. Finally, the administration never said anything, never objected, they never came to any of the podia in Washington to say, Knight Ridder is reporting this and it's totally false, because that would have been the best advertising we could have asked for. And I'll just leave you with this. I was the Pentagon correspondent. Warren was the State Department correspondent. And I remember going into a Rumsfeld briefing one afternoon, and one of my colleagues from a very prestigious publication came up and patted me on the back and said, keep going. And I said to her, why aren't you doing the same thing? So just very quickly, The Guardian, my friend Julian Borger from The Guardian, he did a bunch of reporting, not like we did. And then, his name will come back to me, from the Washington Post, Walter Pincus tried to get stories into his newspaper, and he got like a couple on the front page, and then they relegated him to the back pages, and that was the end of Walter's attempt to try and report this out.
Well, Kelley, you have in some ways the most extraordinary story, because Jonathan is talking about just the climate at that time and the rah-rah, go USA, and the relentless drumbeat. And, over at TNR, Peter was doing this sort of like carefully cultivated, liberal, moral, intellectual argument. Fox News, where you were, they were the foremost cheerleaders, go America, all in. And you were writing there at the time, you're conservative, coming from the right of the spectrum. So what was this experience like for you? And how did you come to a place where you thought, this is not correct?
Well, thank you, and thank you to, and can everybody hear me okay?
No, fair.
Sounds like,
Okay.
Can we turn up her mic?
Can we turn it up a little?
Try now.
Does that sound good? Better? No? Seems like.
Yell at us.
I
There
think
you
it's
go.
on, so
That'll
why don't I
work.
just do this? Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be sitting next to you. Honestly, I can't match the bravery of your journalism. As Krystal said, I was at Fox News writing for their website, foxnews.com, before 9/11, on 9/11, and after 9/11. And I was writing straight news. And so I had come into the job to cover Washington politics at the time. And after the war, quickly found that there was an agenda that was being pressed upon the news network from the top. As you all know, Fox News is a conservative Republican news network, and they, rushed the battle stations to support the Bush agenda after 9/11 and the Republican agenda in Congress. And I think my skepticism immediately started to present itself after the Patriot Act was passed, and there was no debate about it in Congress, and most Republicans didn't spare a minute to debate about it or question, aside from the libertarians like Ron Paul and Bob Barr. And I started to do stories about this and trying to get the more civil libertarian point of view into my stories, and it was getting more and more difficult. Not only because my immediate editors were great; they're real professionals, and they were happy that I was exploring some of these stories about the policies that were being pushed and passed in the wake of 9/11. But I was finding that the audience for these stories was shrinking. No one, there were, I would call, more left-leaning magazines out there like The Nation, like Mother Jones, and others who were taking up the mantle of civil liberties in the wake of 9/11, but there were no conservatives. They were really closing ranks, as they say, about this, and that was really disturbing to me, except for the hardcore libertarians. So there really wasn't there weren't many platforms. And coming from a conservative news network, I couldn't do any side work for other magazines. Those on the left didn't trust me. and there weren't any on the right. That until the American Conservative, and Scott McConnell is right there at the back wall. He is a co-founder of the American Conservative, was launched in 2002 in opposition to the run-up to the Iraq War, along with Pat Buchanan and Taki Theodopoulos, started that, and Scott worked tirelessly with Kara Hopkins for years, first to stop the rush to the war, and then after to cover its aftermath. And so, as a straight news reporter, I didn't have a lot of options, and finally started writing more opinion pieces. I had to make the leap. And it was really hard, as Jonathan knows, when you get into journalism, particularly in the old days, you went in with this, ethos that you're just going to get the news, you're going to get your sources confirmed, you're going to try to bring in some balance, get both sides of the story. I was finding that more and more difficult as I was seeing the manipulation of the message, the jingoism that Jonathan talked about. There was a proliferation of blogs at the time, but most of the top blogs were very blobby blogs, and so you had the sort of mushy middle that was maybe taking little pokes at the Bush war policy and the run-up to the war, but really wasn't stridently against it, and then you had the right-wing blogs that were, four square for this war. So the invasion happens, I'm still working at Fox, and I start looking for alternatives. I think by the time the war was in full swing and we were seeing all of the insurgency, you're starting to see troops come home with PTSD. Another thing I was able to write about for Fox, ahead of the war in anticipation of that, you're starting to see the proliferation of war profiteers, all of the contracting that was going on. You're just seeing a lot of things at a lower level happening. This war isn't going as good as we're being told on MSNBC, right, Fox, and these others. And that's when I went to TAC to write about this, and very proud that there was this slice of conservatism that was holding the line and challenging power in Washington on the left and the right.
Which remarkably, on the right, this didn't become a truly mainstream conversation until sort of Trump ripped that Band-Aid off in 2016. This is part of how it completely upended our politics. You mentioned the blogosphere, which gives way to independent media, probably is the reason Barack Obama gets elected, probably is the reason Donald Trump gets elected. But I'm really curious to hear from any or all of the three of you about Kelley and Jonathan both brought up kind of like the revenue motive, and you could see your stories weren't getting traction, and presumably Fox News knew where their bread was buttered, and all of these other outlets also knew where their bread was buttered, and that they stood to lose a lot in terms of revenue if they went in another direction. And at the same time, when you look at some of the individual names who were most associated with, pushing the propaganda, they've basically all landed on their feet. Many of them are wealthier, more powerful, more influential than ever before. You think about, Jeffrey Goldberg, Bill Kristol, even Judy Miller landed on her feet. She's at Fox News now. And some of the voices that were on the other side were actually drummed down to the business. So it wasn't just a revenue incentive from the media perspective. There was also a real sort of professional incentive to go along to get along. So I'd love to hear, any of you talk a little bit about that and whether you feel there was any accountability for the people who got this so wrong in such a catastrophic way.
Well, I'm not going to dive wholeheartedly into that question, but I will just say that there's been very little accountability at all. There wasn't a single senior. So let me start again. This was not just a journalistic failure. It wasn't just an administration using an exaggerated and bogus case to go to war. This was a systemic failure. It was a failure by the Congress because you had only a few members who were going, what is going on here? And it was the then chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Bob Graham from Florida, who forced the administration to do what they should have done, what you're supposed to do, in order to make the case for war, which is to do what's called a national intelligence estimate. It is the highest level intelligence analysis that the intelligence community produces. But they didn't do that in order to justify the war. He basically came out and said, I'm not hearing anything new, you need to do this, and they finally did it, and we know that those were the documents that they produced, the classified NIE, which eventually had to be declassified, and the unclassified version. There were massive differences between what the government was telling people with clearances and what it was telling the American public. There's been no accountability. Similarly, there's been no accountability for the CIA torture program. I mean, there's been no accountability. As you said, Judy Miller landed on her feet. There were some on the left who refused to back down, the Dixie Chicks, but now they call themselves the Chicks because they were taken off the radio because of their opposition to the war. So yeah, I think that accountability then and now remains a very rare commodity in American governance.
Peter, you've done incredibly deep soul searching, I think really admirably so, about how you had a wrong set of assumptions that led you to this place. Do you feel like that's common among our peers and colleagues? Do you feel like anything was learned, or do you think that we're set up where this could all just happen again because basic access journalism is still a thing, revenue incentives, professional incentives, these are all still a thing, groupthink is still a thing?
I mean, the irony is what you started with, right? Which was that from pretty early on, you saw that there were political revolts against the war. It started with Howard Dean in 2004, kind of came out of nowhere because he was the one guy in the Democratic field who hadn't supported the war, and he almost won the nomination, right? And then I think you're exactly right. I don't think Barack Obama would have defeated Hillary Clinton had he not opposed the war. And then I don't think Trump was entirely honest about what his real position on the war had been, but he was willing to say in this critical moment, unlike the other Republican candidates on the stage, what are you talking about? That was a disaster. Bush was a total screw-up.
Well, and to Jeb Bush's face, too.
To Jeb Bush's face. That was a crucial kind of moment of kind of puncturing this unreality. And so, but the question is then, I mean, as you set up, given that there's clearly a popular hunger for this shift, why doesn't it actually play itself out very much in Washington? And I think I think a couple of things play into it, I think. One of which is what you mentioned, which is I do think that that a lot of the people who end up serving in American foreign policy have worked in institutions that are funded by defense contractors or other people who are basically in what Eisenhower famously called the military-industrial complex, and they're likely to go back to those jobs afterwards. Whether it's certain think tanks or whether it's consulting firms, and the media, and I think this is where the media fails, the media does not do a good job of even making that clear, right? So you can be a former official and you can maybe have an academic affiliation and that's the only thing you're known by, or you're a former government official. No one will actually know if you go on TV or write an op-ed what you're actually, where most of your money is coming from.
You're not like, oh, by the way, also on the board of Lockheed Martin.
Yeah, so then people would then, I mean, I'm not even saying don't give this person a platform, but at least allow people to think about the fact that their views, we're all shaped by our experiences. None of us are pure. We're all shaped to some degree by our bottom lines, right? I mean, you don't have to be a vulgar Marxist to believe that. It's just the way human beings are. And yet we don't actually, that's not exposed. I think the second thing is that the people who make American foreign policy, I think, tend to, in general, be far less representative of the American public than even the people at high levels of domestic policy. That American foreign policy elites are much whiter, more male than the American public. And I think it matters because American exceptionalism, which I think is part of the ideology that drives American intervention, which tends to see America's enemies, adversaries as essentially evil and us as essentially good, is something that people whose families have suffered in the United States or have family connections to the global South, where America has done a lot of terrible imperial things, tend to be more skeptical of these exceptionalist assumptions. Those people tend to not have as much tend to be very underrepresented in these positions, and so I think that's part of the reason that you have a kind of self-perpetuation of these kind of people in foreign policy positions, both in the media and in government.
And yet, Kelley, Quincy Institute is doing incredible work with your involvement at trying to change some of those fundamental underlying dynamics in DC. And by the way, having some success at it. So I wonder if you see some hope that that sort of DC groupthink is changing a bit, especially when you see these strange horseshoe coalitions coming together around ending our support for the atrocities in Yemen as one example, or changing our approach to Syria as another example. And you've got, Matt Gaetz and AOC on the same side of some of these things. Does that give you hope that there's a kind of new political coalition and new representation for people who have always been skeptics out there in the American public?
I do, because I think 20 years after the war, it's not only skepticism, but a complete lack of faith in our institutions. It's like scales have been wiped from people's eyes on both the left and the right. You mentioned Trump and the 2016 campaign and how he was able to stand up on a stage and basically call Jeb Bush, his brother, a liar and a failure and get away with it. Everybody thought after that somehow oh, he's lost, it's done. It actually boosted his numbers. And so we have a real dynamic fervor on the right for restraint. And it's not only politically driven. And I've seen this, and I think it bears out. You have folks who, yes, they're happy if there's a Republican in office, but they're happy to criticize that Republican too if they feel like they are pursuing overseas adventures at the cost of real national defense. So I see that on the right. On the left, there's obviously a legacy of anti-war, non-intervention. We have our differences on Ukraine, for example, that I believe at some point will be sorted out. But to your point, I do feel like the 20 years of the lies that we've been fed. We're not talking about Afghanistan here, but the Washington Post did this incredible story, sort of an autopsy on Afghanistan, and found out that our generals, our top State Department officials, did not believe we were winning that war 10 years ago, and it only came out afterwards. So people see this and they're digesting this, and so I think that can have positive repercussions, because we're not going to take things hook, line, sinker. We're not going to be drinking the Kool-Aid like we are. Hey, it's still happening, and I'm not going to lie. We can talk about the coverage of the Ukraine war and the policies there and the support for it and why. But I do see a deep-seated skepticism. I just want to say one thing about Quincy and what you were talking about with the foreign policy establishment. The foreign policy establishment is like one leg of the stool. I feel like if we're going to talk about Iraq and what happened there and the media failures, and the media obviously is the other stool, but also the military too. And I know we probably don't have enough time to talk about it, but I feel like the military spent billions of dollars on information operations to manage the message. And that included co-opting the mainstream media, which had been consolidated down to 8 corporate entities owning all of the media. And they were able to do this. They managed the reporters that were inside the Green Zone and inside Iraq. We had hundreds of embeds right after the invasion. There were single digits there by 2007. The rest of the reporting that was being done aside from your fantastic work, but were these stenographers who were just getting what they were being spoon-fed in the briefing room. So I like to blame the military for its manipulation of the media, which was in turn manipulating us.
Well, and Jonathan, go ahead, jump in.
There are some senior people from the Bush administration who have been expressed contrition. So I don't want it to make it sound as if they've all, they all went to ground or haven't paid a price. Rich Armitage has said they were wrong. Featured him and Larry Wilkerson, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff, in a story we did last week. I co-authored on 20 years and all of the dire consequences that we're still facing in the region, and without hesitation, disaster, the worst the worst foreign policy screw up perhaps in American history. And then finally, when you're talking about sort of the left and the right, one of the things I found really fascinating, when John McCain ran for president, I was assigned to go back and look and do a big piece on his foreign policy. And we all remember, bomb Iran, and he was one of the real fervent promoters for the invasion of Iraq. But he wasn't always like that. Yeah. And this guy went and was imprisoned and tortured by the North Vietnamese, and he came out of that experience opposed to American foreign military intervention overseas. He was a fervent, like Ronald Reagan wanted to denuclearize the world in the end, right? But John McCain didn't start out that way. It's after he became head of the Project for a New American Century that somehow he went through, because I went through virtually all his speeches before and after. And I'm not sure why he transformed the way he did, but there were people on the right who once upon a time would have very much opposed the invasion.
Well, Jonathan, let me ask you this, because access journalism still a thing, groupthink still a thing, revenue, profit incentives still a thing. But one thing that's different, I think, is it would have been much more difficult to bury and ignore your stories today. Do you think that is the case? Do you think things may have unfolded differently in the ecosystem we have now, which, listen, I'm pessimistic about the media in a lot of ways, but there are a lot more dissenting voices. There is an independent media ecosystem. There is social media. Do you think it would have been possible to quash your stories the way that they did?
No, I mean, we as I said, we didn't have Facebook. We didn't have Twitter. I mean, the way I promote my stories now, outside of Reuters readership, and Reuters readership is pretty big, is to tweet out the links to my stories. We didn't have that back then. We didn't have any other social media platforms by which we could promote our stories. Our stories were ignored by the rest of the mainstream press. They were ignored by the administration. As I said, it would have been the best possible advertising we could have asked for. And yet some people were, there was a publication, I don't know if they still do it, but the Pentagon would put together, their press op would put together a publication every morning called The Early Bird. And The Early Bird contained a compendium of the previous day's, national security stories. And believe it or not, The Early Bird used to pick up the stuff that we did. And that's how people knew what we were doing. But no, I mean, today, absolutely, there would be no way to suppress what we were writing. Back then, as I said, no social media, 32 newspapers, but all of them were local or metropolitan dailies, like the Miami Herald, like the Philadelphia Inquirer. And as I said, some of our own papers wouldn't run our stories. Why? Because they weren't in the Washington Post or the New York Times.
Yeah. One of the other things that I've certainly noted is there just seems to be this sort of baked-in hawkishness among a lot of legacy press. You see it on the Sunday shows, you see it on cable news routinely. One example that certainly comes to mind is when Trump launched the missile strikes on Syria. You had Fareed Zakaria saying it was the day he became president. There are many examples like, marveling at the glory and the splendor of these missiles, and always an instinct that we need to do something. That always seems to be the impetus that you see certainly on television news. Do you think that's an accurate assessment? Where do you think that sort of knee-jerk reaction comes from? Anybody? Peter?
I think it's across a lot of different parts of the media, and I think I think it's partly rooted in this exceptionalist assumption that basically there are bad regimes out there that do bad things, and America basically either stands back and doesn't do anything, or America goes and makes things better, to put it in kind of really, really, first grade kind of level. And I do think it's partly built on a kind of certain, it's amazing the degree to which World War II still remains the dominant template through which so many people talk about it, as if America didn't do anything else. Even, of course, like the totally Disneyfied vision of World War II, right? I mean, which was hardly, in which America did some pretty awful things even in that war. But, and so in some ways, like the notion that actually America could make things worse, right? That even in a regime which is a terrible regime, which is doing terrible things to its people, as in Syria, for instance, or as in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, or as in other places, that actually American sanctions, which basically create a situation in which people are brutalized by the regimes and then also starve because they can't actually engage economically with the outside world, or American military action in which then people are kind of also doesn't end up freeing people, but either creates a failed state, as in kind of Libya, for instance, or basically just kills a bunch of people who are hardly responsible, happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, hardly responsible for the terrible things their regimes do. I think, there's just, it's very difficult. And again, it goes back to my point of we don't have enough people in important positions of the media who, when they think about the history of American foreign policy, they think about America's toppling of democratic regimes all over Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, right? They don't think about sanctions policies in Cuba, for instance, that for decades and decades have been denounced by the international community because they deny the repository of experiences that lead people to form their impressions of the next foreign policy event, I think, is far too limited and doesn't and leads exceptionalist narratives to be dominated. I think my phone is
talking to you.
My phone disagrees. Sorry.
Well, and how much too is it like a bias toward credentialing? I mean, if you have a lot of people who have come through, various administrations that have all been part of terrible decision making at one point or another, but these are the people who have the professional, serious expertise, and they're the ones that are getting booked for these shows. I mean, how much of that leads to this just self-perpetuating cycle?
Yeah, I was looking at some statistics before I came in here, and it was amazing. In 2003, during the run-up and the aftermath of the invasion, the major news networks, MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News, they had, in terms of the pro-war, guests that they had on, it was like 6 times the number of anti-war people, like the skeptics of what was going on their screen. And so the guests that they were having on were all from the military, they were all from the government, or they were courtiers, in this imperial city who worked and served, all of the vested interests in the war. And this went on for years. I remember watching and just screaming at the television. I'm like, I know that there are people out there, whether they be Andy Basovich, who's, our chairman of the board at Quincy. For years, he was pumping out articles, questioning the surge, questioning the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. He's eloquent. He's respected. He's a Boston professor. He is a Vietnam veteran. And they had him on PBS NewsHour once in a while. He should have been a regular on these shows, but they always chose power. And it was always military generals, retired generals, who they did not say were serving on the boards of these defense contracting companies. And so, I don't know if I'm sure people in this room remember the message force multipliers. David Barstow did an incredible expose that the Pentagon was actually cultivating these ex-generals who are on the boards, I think, collectively of 150 defense contractors, and then delivering them literally to MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News, not telling them that they were basically working for the Pentagon, and they were going on and just delivering talking points for the Pentagon. And none of this was disclosed, or their board memberships either. And so I feel like there's a lot of blame to go around, and I do blame these corporate executives of these news organizations for just succumbing to it. And I do understand that there is this nervousness on the behalf of the media, and particularly editors and producers. They don't want to look weak. They want to look like that they have the experts, and they end up getting rolled. They get rolled by the experts, and that happened for 20 years.
Just briefly, I think another thing that was really important after 9/11, but remains a huge problem, is it's striking how few voices, when it comes to U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East, actually come from the Arab or Muslim worlds. And I think that's partly because the atmosphere of post 9/11, and even before 9/11, was deeply Islamophobic and made it very, very difficult for people who are actually from Arab or majority Muslim countries to actually rise in foreign policy discussions. And also, and I think I should say this because this is pretty, it's also that if you had expressed sympathy for Palestinians and Palestinian freedom, that was a very, very, very quick way to be marginalized. And so a lot of one of the reasons I think that
I would say.
it still is very much, and one of the reasons I think that people in academia who studied the Middle East, who were the Americans who knew this region the best, had so little influence in Washington in that period, was partly because so many of those people were politically delegitimized because they held positions, particularly on Israel-Palestine, that essentially made them impossible to bring into the Washington conversation, and that remains a problem.
Yeah, and meanwhile, John Bolton is still treated as a serious commentator.
Story last week, too.
Not repentant.
Got a couple of things. So just a note that I recorded an Al Jazeera show today with Andy Beishovich, so it's going to be aired tomorrow. I don't know what time. Couple of things. When I covered both on the ground, the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, and I've been spending a lot of time in front lines in Ukraine too over the last 10 months. But one of my rules is if I'm going to report a story about a foreign war or any place that I report on, I want to go there. I want to experience it. I want to try and understand it, even if I don't have the language. I've been going to Afghanistan, and this will date me, since I covered the last 4 years of the Soviet occupation. So I kind of get Afghanistan. I've been spending a lot of time there. And then my editor, John Walcott, had what he called the Landay rule, which is what I would try and do when I deploy to these places is, I want to know the impact of a decision made at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue on this little village up in the Hindu Kush, and how it plays there, and how the local mullah and his people view that decision and how it impacts their lives. For me, that is probably one of the most important kind of stories that I could write as a war correspondent. But a lot of these people who go on these programs, a lot of the officials that we see on this rotating, the rotating door, government and then think tanks and then government and then think tanks, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them don't do that. A lot of them have learned what they know in the academy. They have served in embassies, they've gone to conferences overseas, but they haven't done what myself and a lot of other war correspondents do, which is to actually go to that village in the Hindu Kush and try to understand the other side. One last real quick point. I went unilaterally to northern Iraq, and I spent 4 months in Iraqi Kurdistan. The Iranians let me cross into Iraqi Kurdistan, and I spent 4 months there waiting for the invasion. But the people who were embedded, and hats off to the American military, because they embedded 600 reporters, which is pretty amazing for me. And only a few were kicked out for violating the rules. But they only got to see half, I remember Rumsfeld asked me privately, he said, how would you grade this? And I'd say, I'd give you 50%. Why? Because we only reported one side of the story. Yes, there were reporters who were allowed to stay, not many, by Saddam, who were subject, to what they call his information minister, who nicknamed Baghdad Bob, was the garbage that he was trying to plant. But they didn't see, the guys who were riding with the troops did not see. They watched the Americans firing, these weapons and dropping ordnance, but they didn't see what that ordnance did. They weren't on the other side to report what happened, how that impacted ordinary Iraqis. And as I said, when I go to war zones, and as I said, I've spent 3.5 of the last 10 months on the front lines in Ukraine, I try and focus on that. How is this war impacting people in villages who nowhere else to go and have stayed in these decimated frontline villages. But I want to know how the war is impacting them. And then you can come back to Washington, and then you'll have a much more rounded view of American decisions to intervene.
Yeah.
And you're able to present that in a much more balanced way. I'm not going to say fair and balanced, but a balanced way.
It's been ruined. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open up for some questions from you all. So start thinking if you have questions that you want to ask our panelists here. You know, not everyone, we can't rely on every reporter to have the personal heroic characteristics that Jonathan appears to have. So how do we, and also I don't think Judy Miller is like a uniquely horrific human being. I think she probably was like, you know, the one that happened to have these contexts and ends up being the useful idiot. There are probably a million other people in this town who could have served as useful idiot under similar circumstances. So how do we change the nature and the incentives within these media organizations so that we don't end up in another situation like this?
I mean, I think it's very quickly, I think it's a great question. One thing, credit to the Biden administration, they perhaps were looking back at what happened in Iraq with all of the garbage that was being planted on the rest of the mainstream media. And said, we're not going to do that with Ukraine. And so they were very proactive in declassifying top secret intelligence and disseminating it to the public before the war began. So that they weren't accused of serving up this menu of cherry-picked intelligence when it came to the decision to back Ukraine in this war. And so I think there have been lessons learned. But there are always more lessons to be learned.
Peter, what do you think?
I don't know. I do think that, you know, the success of shows like yours and others shows that there is an appetite for different kind of foreign policy conversation. And I also think that one of the benefits of the internet is that it's easier for Americans than it used to be to read news and a commentary come from other parts of the world. And I think one just kind of basic, very important thing for consumers is, you know, if America's going to go and fight a war or do a military intervention, try to learn something about what people in that part of the world are saying. It seems kind of pretty basic, but actually that was very little of that was happening pre-Iraq war, and I think there's more of an opportunity for it now.
Yeah. Kelley, what about you?
I just find it's going to be difficult when you have all of the mainstream media is owned right now by 6 conglomerates. And they have different incentives and different interests, and it's called money and shareholders, and it's not about journalistic integrity. And believe me, I love what you guys are doing at Breaking Points. I love what I'm doing at Responsible Statecraft, and there's all sorts of independent media. I'm afraid for them to get ghettoized on one side, where we have people who are interested and they're curious and they're going to alternative news sources, but you still have this mainstream media that has a stranglehold on most of America. So they're getting, if Americans are marginally interested in foreign policy and how it affects them, they go to their mainstream sources. And as long as you have, you know, the Washington Post and New York Times going to like 1 or 2 sources for what's going on in Ukraine, like the Institute for the Study of War, and not asking the important questions and getting a balanced view of what's going on the ground there, I feel like we're going to stumble into the same situation. We might stumble into another war. And so I see a lot of lessons learned. I agree with Jonathan, but I'm just more skeptical because of who owns the media in this country.
I think that's a great point, especially given Knight Ridder, as you point out at the beginning, doesn't even exist anymore.
I work for Reuters. We're not an American company. We're actually we're a Canadian-owned company. But we are the biggest news organization in the world, and I do not have any of those kind of constraints. I do the reporting that I do. And I think the reporting on the war in Ukraine has actually, given the fact that I've spent a lot of time on the ground, has actually been pretty accurate. You know, again, suffers from one of the problems that we had in Iraq, which is that most people don't have reporters on the Russian side of things, and so can't get a really good feel for what's going on over there. Only Reuters actually does have a couple of stringers who do file from the Russian side of things, but it's in a careful manner because it's a question of anyway, in a careful manner. Let me leave it like that. But again, I think that we got a lot of access to the front lines in Ukraine. The Ukrainian military is very good about determining where we can go and who we can talk to. But nevertheless, I think by and large, the coverage has been pretty good.
All right, let's go ahead and turn it over to the audience. I think there are mics that are getting passed around somewhere. There we go. Oh, I wasn't looking at hands. We'll go with this gentleman right here. That's your.
Hi, thank you guys for being here. It's really funny. I just came from a class in a building with a giant banner of GW alum Colin Powell's face on it. It's pretty ironic. It reminds me how much of a pipeline. What?
I got a Condoleezza Rice quote right there.
Oh yeah, I saw that too. No, it really reminds me how much of a pipeline GW tends to be, and especially the Elliott School for the military-industrial complex. One of my professors from last semester, Elizabeth Anker, talks about melodrama in her book Orgies of Feeling and the contradictions in how the government presented the reasons for war, with us being simultaneously like strong liberators, but also victims of 9/11. Not to make you guys feel old, but I wasn't alive yet when 9/11 happened. Yeah, I'm sorry. So my question is, how do you think the U.S. manufactured our consent? And as young progressives, what warning signs should we look out for in our media and government to see if they're hawking for war? I remember when the U.S. government pulled out of Afghanistan, Kyle Kalinske said something about how the media would promote that, the Taliban's dangerous, they're going to move in and take the land, and it's not true. They're not going to go in. And then they did. And being like, okay, well, he's independent and progressive, and he got it wrong. So what kind of Oh, hi, Kyle. I'm sorry. No offense. No. The point is that I hate mainstream media, and I love people like you. But once in a while, when we're trying not to be like mainstream media, we get it wrong. So my question is, what kind of language and rhetoric do you think they use to sell a war besides fear-mongering?
Yeah.
And how do we avoid, opposing too much to like MSNBC and CNN and ending up like kind of what happened with Kyle, who admitted that he was wrong, by the way.
Yeah.
Credit to him.
I'm saying that it wasn't their fault.
Yeah.
My point was that even if it does fall, it's on their first.
And you were 100% right.
Garden fights with my fiance. Here we go. Let me take one stab at this, and I want to hear from the panel. I think what you identify is a real issue in independent media, which is a couple things. One is audience capture. This is not speaking specifically to Kyle now. It's quite the opposite of Kyle, in fact. But where there's still like a revenue incentive where you're thinking like, oh, what are they going to click on and what are they going to want to hear? And that can lead people into bad places. There's also a knee-jerk contrarianism, which can be just as silly as going along with the conventional wisdom all the time. Then you're just reacting, okay, whatever the conventional wisdom is, I'm going to be the opposite of that. And that will lead you to, silly and incorrect places as well. I think the important thing, and, I can speak for what we do at Breaking Points, where we are definitely going to be wrong and have been wrong and try to admit it when we are wrong. But we try to make sure that our incentives are aligned with being as honest with our audience about what we actually think as possible. And that means depending on, no corporate funding, not talking to any corporate ad sponsors, not reading any corporate ads on the podcast, relying a lot on grassroots support for the show, but not exclusively on that to try to avoid that audience capture. And to me, that's at the bottom of how you transform the media space. And maybe legacy media isn't reformable, but maybe we can create something else that's better that I think is growing and blossoming now. But you have to avoid those same pitfalls of having bad incentives to just have a contrarian take or tell your audience what you think that they want to hear, because that serves your personal and professional ambition?
So let me start off by saying that I'm a GW grad too. I didn't get taken in, and I'm not part of any pipeline. So let's not generalize here. Fear is the biggest motivator. I mean, and that's what the Bush administration played on when it put out its case for war, but not just to the American public, to the world. And just to reiterate, the case was Saddam Hussein has got weapons of mass destruction, including reconstituting his nuclear weapons program, and he could give these weapons to Al-Qaeda. I mean, that was in a nutshell. But they didn't do it just for the American public. There is a paper that they distributed, and again, this is before social media, so it had to be picked up and read. But when Bush went to the United Nations to make his case, they distributed a paper called, I think it was called A Decade of Deception and Denial. And it encompasses their case for invading. And after all of these recitations of different UN Security Council resolutions, they start talking about their case for WMD. And it is just a compendium of garbage. And including, so on the, one of Judy Miller's most consequential stories, and I remember the date, December 2nd, 2002, she talked about a defector, an Iraqi defector, who had been into all of these WMD facilities and had, water wells, hospitals, palaces, nuclear, biological, chemical, who she had talked to and met. The INC, the Iraqi National Congress, had presented this guy to her in Bangkok, and she, transcribed it word for word, basically, put it in the Times, and in this paper that, now this guy was determined to have been coached when they submitted him to a CIA polygraph. And yet, they put that material in that paper. Why? Because it had been in the New York Times, where they didn't footnote it at first to the New York Times, later they did. And so, yes, it was about fear. When we made this movie, Woody Harrelson played me. I have a little more hair than he does. And Woody, I had to disabuse Woody of the idea that the invasion was about oil. It wasn't. It was not about taking the oil. If anything, it was about ensuring that the market wasn't controlled by Saddam Hussein, and that had free passage of oil through the Gulf. But again, I didn't see really any monetary incentive at all to this invasion, or to the people, the talking heads who were promoting it. Perhaps I can't get behind the motives of the networks and putting all these people on.
Yeah.
But again, I won't go into the reasons why I think they invaded. I think there are multiple reasons. But again, fear was the major motivator here.
Yeah. Well, you think about, Phil Donahue, highest rated show on MSNBC, loses it because one of the few anti-war voices that were out there in the incentives.
And he, by the way, if you want to see it, it's still online. Bill Moyers did a documentary. This is how Rob Reiner found us. He did a documentary called Buying the War. And Donahue is one of the people who's on this. But he found out about it because the first person to write about us was in the New York Review of Books, a guy by the name of Michael Massing. And the name of the article is Now They Tell Us. Right.
Another question. Let's go over here.
Thank you very much. Speaking of nuclear weapons, I wanted to see if you see any parallels between the road to 2003 and the invasion of Iraq and what's happening right now with Iran's nuclear program. Are there any signs that we're headed in that direction? And whether, if you think media has learned anything in covering those issues? Thank you.
Are you saying in terms of building the case for war with Iran?
Yes.
No, not on the American public. But, you know, I think the ascension of the far-right Israeli government makes that a real possibility. You know, with Netanyahu in the crisis that he is right now, what better mechanism to use, which a lot of leaders use, have used throughout history, is to deflect you know, the focus away from him and onto a foreign crisis. And so I think there's concern that perhaps the Israelis might be more tempted now, but I don't see at all the American, this administration prepping at all for any kind of military intervention in Iran.
But I do think that one of the dynamics that Krystal was talking about, which is the kind of misinformation of the American public, still remains. I looked at some data a while ago. Most Americans think that Iran already has a nuclear weapon, right? Because they've just heard so much conversation about Iran's, you know, imminent getting a nuclear weapon, and they've decided Iran. Whereas actually, many, many fewer Americans know that Israel has a nuclear weapon. Actually, probably hundreds of nuclear weapons, right? So it's I think it's an example of the way in which a kind of constant. I'm not saying that the idea of an Iranian nuclear weapons program is a fiction necessarily, but I'm just saying that there's a way in which a constant drumbeat from a particular kind of angle, which leaves out particular. So, you know, for instance, it's important to know that Israel has nuclear weapons if you're going to have a conversation about whether an Iranian nuclear weapon would be an existential threat to Israel, right? And once you realize that Israel has deterrence on, you know, quite a sophisticated deterrence mechanism, then actually it might not seem like an Iranian nuclear weapon, I don't think it would be a good thing, represents an existential threat. But there's certain things that tend to be often left out of these conversations and important, and other things that get kind of communicated to people that are actually misleading.
The irony here is that that the Iranians have enriched up to 60%. They can make a weapon with 60% highly enriched uranium. They can make a weapon. So if the administration was this 90%, I don't know how many people follow this closely, but the 90% is a political red line. They could make a weapon now. If the administration was really worried that they were going to, we would be hearing that. They'd be whipping that up. I think right now they're in conflict. They're in crisis avoidance when it comes to Iran because they're already dealing with Ukraine and China.
Another question? Sorry, I was trying to see if there was. Go ahead, sir. Looking to see if there were any women who had questions as well.
Mm-hmm. So, yes, they still do have the early bird news. I'm a retired Army officer. Today, I was in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals as a Guantanamo defense attorney on a long-running appellate case. A couple things I'd like to quickly say here. We used to have the War Crimes Act. Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld, they got rid of that, one of the Military Commissions Acts, that all the Republicans always supported. I think one thing that needs to be corrected, and nobody should leave this room thinking that, well, we have an alternative. We've got Matt Gaetz out there who's against the Ukraine war. But he's just Google Matt Gaetz and China. You'll see that he's in the forefront of calling for war against China. I think we've got a sort of a naive view of war here that unless you see tanks crossing international borders, there's not war. But the United States military readily concedes that we're in perpetual war. There's no longer those bright shining lines between phases of the war. I recommend this article here by Jonathan Shell talking about the Cheney doctrine, Cheney-Wolfowitz doctrine. We really do believe, and getting to Trump here, a couple points. Trump is just genuinely loved in Israel. I just came from Israel last week where I observed military courts. A total travesty of any kind of justice or even of the term courts. Shouldn't even be allowed to call it courts. Same with Guantanamo. But the Republicans always support this, and do most of the Democrats evermore every year. But I think the point we should be recognizing is that Trump was personified Islamophobia. Go back, and I mean, younger people here may not be aware of this, but Trump immediately, and this is according to the New York Times, which ordinarily isn't that reliable, but in this case it was because it was also confirmed so many other ways. Trump and Netanyahu immediately began a clandestine war against Iran when Trump took office. Just lately, James Bamford is publishing a book on the cognitive warfare operations of Israel on behalf of Trump to get him elected on behalf of by Netanyahu. There's a whole lot more that could go on here, and I'll not take any more time. But we we should not leave this room with any simplistic understanding of what war really is. My background is in psyops also. Cognitive war is what it's called today. And that's an ongoing campaign by the U.S. military and CIA, who hasn't been mentioned here, who has been guilty of so many war crimes, but yet there's no accountability whatsoever for torture, all these other war crimes that now we're saying Putin should be subject to war crimes trials. So I think I would only end here that I hope people leave here without any simplistic ideas that, Iraq was bad, but now we're on a new course. And if you only turn to Matt Gaetz and Josh Hawley and a few of these other conservatives who want war against China, everything will be well. I'll stop there, but it's a complicated situation that we need intelligence to understand.
You go right here. You can just pass it down.
Hi, I'm also a student here. This question is for all of you guys, but also mainly Kelley. You mentioned, 6 corporations control all of mass media today. And I guess, do you guys think that legacy media is reformable? If so, how? And if not, how can we grow, independent media?
Yeah, and I think that's probably a better question for Krystal, who's actually growing independent media. I'm, just absolutely stunned with the growth of Breaking Points and the number of followers and listeners and viewers you have.
Trust me, I am too.
Yeah, but that means there's an appetite for it, and I know that having been in the media in many different capacities. Over the last 25 years, I see that there is a thirst and a hunger for alternative media. There always has been,
Yeah.
But now we have the platforms and the vehicles with which to grow them. But I go back to my skepticism about the corporate media because like I said, there's different incentives.
I am of the opinion that legacy media is not reformable, but that doesn't cause me to despair because I think we're in a different moment in American culture anyway. We don't have a monoculture anymore the way that we used to. I mean, this is why not just with media, but movies. Why we're reaching back to nostalgia and making another Top Gun. Why most music that's downloaded is from when I was growing up and not what's current, because everything has splintered and fractured. I mean, that has potential benefits if you cultivate a new ecosystem that is better, healthier, allows dissent, allows diversity of viewpoints. So there's a real opportunity there to have a whole, blossoming of a new ecosystem that is, not necessarily going to replace legacy media, but be a more important complement to it. Because the idea of, everybody sitting down and watching the same news at night, that's long, long dead. You see trust in media declining, I think deservedly so. So there's an opportunity for, in this new world where it's a little more, niche and a little more divided, there's an opportunity for something better. There's also risks that everybody just ends up in their little silos just hearing what they want to ultimately hear. So it's kind of an interesting but also perilous moment, I would say. Let's go over here, this gentleman with the glasses.
Thanks for this. A lot of the neocons that promoted the war said it was democracy promotion. Did they believe that, and did it play a real role in the Bush decision to go to war?
I think there were some. I mean, look, there was a convergence of motives. I don't think all of the people at the upper levels of the Bush administration shared the same motives for invading Iraq. You want to start at the top with George W. Bush. Saddam tried to kill my daddy. I honestly believe that was part of it. But I also, think that this is a guy who, is a deep believing Christian on whose watch 9/11 happened. And I think he had some kind of epiphany. Like he was the guy who was going to destroy the dictators and the terrorists of the world. So there'd be no more 9/11s and no more weapons of mass destruction. You come down to the next level, which is Cheney, Rumsfeld. These are two senior officials whose worldview was shaped by the Cold War. And I think it was someone here who said, someone on the panel, I think it was you, who talked about the need to demonstrate that the United States was not going to be intimidated by 9/11. and doing that in Afghanistan, as we know from the NSC meeting on September 12th, was, which they viewed Afghanistan as a pile of rocks, right? And dropping bombs there wasn't going to have the kind of effect that they wanted to have. And so I think they decided, they looked at the so-called axis of evil, and they said, which one is the easiest? And I believe Wolfowitz as much as said this, that in testimony in the Hill, that they looked at this and they saw Iraq would probably be the easier one of the three. And so they wanted to demonstrate American power was not going to be cowed. I think they also would believe this man, Chalabi, who said he was going to forge diplomatic relations with Israel and would allow American troops to be based in Iraq, in the middle of, like, the swath of instability across the world. And I think that is what drove them. And then down the next level, you have the Doug Fifes and the Wolfowitzes and the Richard Pearls, who truly, for some reason, believed that if you implemented democracy in Iraq, it would flower all over the Middle East and there would be peace with Israel. Now, how they came to that conclusion, I'm not sure. But if any student of that region, anyone who's spent any time there, would know that that just was not the case. And in fact, this is one of the things that got us thinking about their case for war against Iraq, right? That they were making this case that Saddam Hussein was in league with Osama bin Laden, and yet Saddam was actually the very secular Arab dictator that bin Laden was bent on overthrowing. And so that was something else that got us on this path, in this reporting path, because it made no sense.
Can I just add on? I think it also, I don't think that, I think for some of the people who genuinely did believe that this would spread democracy, I don't think they had the capacity to imagine that democracy would produce an anti-American government. For them, democratization and spreading Americanism was the same thing. And it goes back to this very, very limited and impoverished set of experiences that they were drawing from and lack of understanding of American history, that very often America has been hostile to democracy because democracy has produced anti-American governments. Very few people in Latin America would find that a surprising statement, right? Or in many other parts of the world. But I think for Wolfowitz, who was very influenced by the Philippines and by a couple of other examples in Latin America, at the end of the Cold War, for him, democratization produced pro-American governments. That was his idea.
All right, one more question. Let's go over here. Yeah.
Hi, so Krystal, first of all, I'm a big fan of Breaking Points, and I promised I would be a premium subscriber if I wasn't a broke college student.
You don't have to.
So my question stems from what I've been having to deal with recently, and it's that what's the most effective way to have these conversations about how, like, legacy media and mainstream media and how it's basically manipulated at this point and corrupted, without sounding like kind of like a conspiracy theorist, like off the edge type of person, because that's largely the reception I've got when I try to bring it up with people, like my parents and people close to me. So,
I mean, to be honest with you, I actually think the Iraq war conversation is a good one because, I mean, they probably at this point are like, well, that wasn't a great idea. So, going back to that moment where you can really see clearly in hindsight, like, this was wrong. Everybody got it wrong. They were lying to us directly on the pages of the New York Times. And by the way, as we talked about before, many of the people who were most complicit, I mean, not only do they land on their feet, but many of them are doing better than ever, while the voices that got it right oftentimes were either lost their careers entirely, pushed to the sidelines, et cetera. So to me, it's actually a good entree for that conversation because I think pretty much everyone at this point could see that case pretty clearly. And then you say, well, what would be different? They didn't reform, they weren't held to account. These are still people that are powerful and influential. So what do you think they might be getting wrong now? And where would you go to find information that isn't corrupted by some of the same incentives? That would be my suggestion. Any other thoughts here?
No, I agree entirely. And what bothers me most about the conversation about the mainstream media and their accountability is that within a year, there were already mea culpas after the invasion in which they were saying, yeah, we got it wrong. There was no WMDs. It was terrible. But then they spent the next 10 years not reporting what was going on the ground in Iraq. I'm not saying not all, but I'm just saying in general. And I'm not just talking about reporters. I'm talking about the opinion makers, which have an unbelievable impact on how we feel and think about the war. And so they spent the next 10 years soft-soaping what was going on, the insurgency, the misdeeds of the American military, the torture, the Blackwater. I mean, it goes down the line, the PTSD, the soldiers coming home. All that was on the back news pages, not on the front news pages. And then Afghanistan, the same thing. So for 20 years, we were told that victory was right around the corner. And then we see what's going on in Afghanistan now, that the very Taliban we were fighting are literally ruling the country, and we're gone. And we don't even talk about like lessons learned. And so I don't know, going back to what you might say to your parents and friends who still have faith in the legacy media, just say, they lied to us for 20 years. You know, it's really unfathomable to me how we would take a lot of these opinion makers seriously, but you're right, Krystal. They're still being called on to pontificate about the war in Ukraine, even though, you know, they in themselves admitted they hadn't had their eye on the ball when it came to WMDs, and now it's 20 years later, and they haven't suffered professionally at all.
I just want to, I think there's a danger here of using too broad a brush, frankly. I have colleagues who were killed in Iraq, colleagues who were killed in Afghanistan, reporters who were dedicated to covering those stories. We didn't put the insurgency on the back pages. We didn't put the torture on the back pages. In fact, when I was with McClatchy, we were finalists, myself and two others, for the Pulitzer Prize for exposing how the CIA had actually interfered with the Senate Intelligence Committee in its putting together the report it did. I think we need to be very careful about taking very terrible examples of media irresponsibility and misreporting and extending that across the board. Because I have to tell you that most of the reporting, as I said, out of Iraq, out of Ukraine has been pretty darn accurate. I think most of the so-called mainstream media have still maintained bureaus in Baghdad and have continued to report on that story. And we can't anymore on Afghanistan because, well, that's not true. There are now, you know, New York Times, Washington Post, Reuters. We've got bureaus again, or never closed them in Kabul, and try to report that as best we can, given the enormous restrictions that the Taliban put on Western media, on any independent media at all. So I really would, you're talking about opinion makers, yeah. That's one thing, you know, the commentators, but, you know, my brothers and sisters put their lives on the line every single day to try and get the most accurate story they possibly can, not just to American people, to the world now, because we have the internet and people all over the world read what we write.
But what I just want to add to that, I loved your reporting, and when I did all my columns for antiwar.com and the American Conservative and wherever else I could get a platform, I would use those stories to inform and persuade. I feel like the mass media, the mainstream media, the opinion makers that I speak of, the commentariat, they didn't utilize, they did you a disservice, because your great reporting and the great reporting on torture, for example, never became part of an ongoing conversation. So when people went on Meet the Press, they weren't talking about those stories, unfortunately. They were talking, they had a general on who was saying victory's right around the corner. So I feel like, I love the reporting that you guys are doing. I'm just saying that it needed to be pushed into the stream of consciousness and the narrative, and it wasn't. And I'm sorry for that.
Yeah. Well, let's have a round of applause for our great panelists. And Dr. Parsi, I think, has a few concluding remarks.
Actually, I don't. I had a very lengthy speech to thank you all with some amazing insights and a fantastic commentary. But we have a hard out in 4 minutes. So I'm going to wrap it up very quickly. I want to thank everyone for coming. It's fantastic to see a full room, a fantastic panel, excellent comments. So delighted that all of you could join us. But the conversation will continue. After you very quickly exit this room, I invite you all to go to upstairs where we will have a reception. Where we will get drinks and entertainment, I understand, and all of the speakers are invited to continue to participate there. And before we close it entirely, I want to give the floor to Adam from the George Washington University chapter of the John Quincy Adams Society, who's one of our partners, to tell you about what they do and about the future events that they will have here on campus. Thank you all so much.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out. I really appreciate it. I know I see a lot of familiar faces in the room today. Great talk. I really appreciate it. It's great to see this sort of stuff at GW now. My name's Aiden. I'm the chapter founder and president of the John Quincy Adams Society at GW. Quick reminder for the students in the room, if you're interested in these sorts of events, you can sign up to become a member of JQAS on GW Engage. And then we'll also have a talk next week on Wednesday in this same building, room 212, with Dr. Paul here about Taiwan and U.S.-Taiwan policy. So we'd love to see you all there, and thank you for coming out. One more round of applause for the panelists. Yeah.
All right, thanks, everyone.
Reception is going to be on the 7th floor. That's just out of the room, up the stairs on the right.